Welcome back to all my modeling pals. The Porsche 962 was campaigned by many race teams in the late 1980s. In this video I'm going to be building this from a racing version, driven by Harald Grohs and Akihiko Nakaya, winners of the 1989 Fuji 500km race. I built this model for the Porsche Group Build, hosted by the Scale Model Car podcast. If you haven't checked them out yet, please be sure to look them up on Spotify. This was my first attempt at a race car model and my first time building a Hasegawa car kit, so I hope you'll enjoy the build video. I'll be back at several points to interject when there's something of interest. Here I'm just using some Tamiya black panel liner to add some depth to the radiators. I followed the color callouts in the instruction manual to paint the dash, including using some of the Tamiya clear paints to paint over the chrome as the instruction manual advised. I got a little confused with the electronics box above the passenger seat. I thought that it went over black, but it's transparent for the decal, so it actually needs to go over a silver or aluminum color. Then I got the bright idea to try to scratch build a harness, so I made all this out of little bits of styrene. Not a good idea. I really need to invest in some photo etch seatbelt hardware, I think. The belt material is ribbon from a sewing section of a craft store. It has a nice texture to it, the color's okay, but it's pretty oversized. It's not real pretty, but it does the job. Since this car had a standalone wing, my first step was to cut off the molded-on uprights that some older 962s used. I used a razor saw for this, as well as a Tamiya scriber, and just kept working at it till eventually they snapped off. After I finished marking off all the mold parting lines, I got to work sanding with my Infinity sanding sponges. I started with 400 grit, then went to 1000, and then went to 2500. I'm under the impression that the team is allowed to run these front canards for the Fuji 500 race. I couldn't find any reference photos from that specific race, but I don't see these canards used elsewhere in their season, so I didn't blend them with the body because I'm assuming they're detachable. I started with a gray primer, not to try to hide the yellow, but to unify the surface and look for any defects that I might have missed during the body prep stage. After a few minor body corrections, it was time to prime with my actual primer color, which is this yellow from Gaia. If you watched my previous build of the Dodge Challenger, you know I used a blue primer on there and I was pretty happy with the result. The yellow primer was a bit more difficult to spray, but I think it really helped the end result with the nice deep yellow color. I used Hasegawa's suggested mixing ratio for the actual body color. I think it turned out a little bit too orange. It's probably intended to go over a white primer in the instructions, but since I used this yellow primer, I think it turned it a little bit more orange than the corresponding color on the decal sheet. So if I were to do this again with yellow primer, I'd probably go like 60-40 in favor of yellow instead. I chose to do this car for my first race car because it doesn't have an insane amount of decals and most of them go over relatively flat surfaces, so I figured this would be a good way to practice. All the decals were applied with Mr. Mark Setter underneath and Mr. Mark Softer over the top. If you're not familiar with Japanese racing history, you might think that I put this decal on backwards, but this was actually quite common from the 70s, as far as I know, through the mid-2000s, maybe even into the 2010s. I don't really know why they did this, but they tended to mirror the decals on what would be the driver's side in Japan so that they'd all line up exactly the same as the passenger side. I don't know, just kind of an interesting style of the era. I think they should bring it back. I let the decal sit for a couple days to dry before I started doing the clear, and once the clear was done, I let that sit for over a week before I started wet sanding, which we'll see later in the video. think this car was so fast and won the Fuji 500 because it didn't have any brake calipers. At least none were included in the box. Having never done tire decals like this before, I thought these were like magic. You put them on, kind of burnish them down, then you get them wet and the film peels off the top. I was like amazed. I had what I thought was a bright idea, and I was gonna kind of blend the decals into the tire a little better with some flat clear, which looked great till I tried to put the tires on, and then as soon as they flexed a little bit, it turned the sidewalls like all milky, and I had to get in there and kind of clean it off, so I guess you're not supposed to do that. The seams on the other side of the wing were a huge pain. I had to fill and then sand probably 4 or 5 times, and in the end I couldn't really hide them completely. It is on the underside of the wing, so it's not too noticeable. If you're a judge watching this before you judge my model at a show, cut me some slack. It was really hard. I attached the end plates with CA glue and used my 123 blocks to ensure they stayed squared up while they dried. I had this metal tape that I got with a ducting kit that I thought I'd try to use for the reflective part of the mirrors, but fortunately it was just too thick. Couldn't really get it to conform, so I peeled it off and went back to the Molotow chrome pen. The headlight covers and the windshield got pretty dinged up in the box. They had some scratches. Not really sure how that happened since they're in their own protective bag. I've never polished clear parts before, but it was time to learn. So I used God Hand sponges, 8,000, then 10,000, and then I used the same polishing compounds like I use on the body from Meguiar's. As you can see here, it made a pretty noticeable difference, so for my first try I was fairly happy with the result. The kit does come with decals to cover part of the headlights, but I knew the color wouldn't be an exact match and I couldn't live with that, so I masked them off pretty carefully and then I sprayed the body color on. I did the same thing for the windshield sun visor as well. It comes with a white decal in the box, but I masked it and sprayed it. To me, a clear orange and clear red were used on the necessary lights, with malotol chrome applied on the back where needed. I used 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000 grit God hand sponges to wet sand the body. Getting into all the nooks and crannies on this body was pretty challenging, so I did the best I could. After all the wet sanding was done, the car was looking really good. When I flatted it back, it was nice and uniform, but after polishing, some sort of dimples appeared. I wouldn't call it orange peel, although it does kind of look like that, so I'm not really sure what happened there. I have to assume there's some sort of underlying paint issue that's actually below the clear coat that no amount of wet sanding was going to reveal or repair, so it still looks okay from a few feet away, but up close, I'm not too pleased. The rear wing is actually a press fit. I didn't need any glue, so that's nice. I can always remove it for transport in the future if I need to. Well, as we get closer to finishing up here, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. Thank you to the Scale Model Car podcast as well for hosting this group build. I had a fun time building my first race car. Certainly not going to be my last, and I'm looking forward to this event again next year.